Hey everybody, welcome back to HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com and here on my YouTube channel, and welcome to another episode of Questions and Coffee with David. This is where I sit down with my cup of coffee every morning and I answer all your questions that come in from email, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter to help you make better music in your home studio. So if you want one of your questions answered in an upcoming episode, please send it to info@HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com. Once again, that's info@HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com, and I'll be sure to feature your question in an upcoming episode. Now, before we get to this week's set of questions, I want to give you a free gift. I want you to go to HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com and go right on the home page. At the top of the page, click on the orange button to get your 5 free Quick Mix Series mixing training courses worth about $110 in value. That's 5 free mixing courses just for visiting HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com. So be sure to do that if you haven't done so already. Also, make sure you subscribe to me on YouTube and hit that notification bell so you'll know when I post a new video. So now let's get on to this week's set of questions and start with question number 1. Okay, question number 1 comes in from Mark on YouTube, and Mark writes in, "Hey David, I have a question about MIDI drums, either EZdrummer or programmed through the piano roll, as Johnny Lipsham teaches in one of your courses. I am happy with the overall results, and I'm getting better, but I'd like to make them sound more real, like real drums. Do you have any tips for EQ, compression, etc., to help achieve this? Thanks for your help in advance, Mark." Well, Mark, thanks for writing in. So Mark is referring to the MIDI Drums Made Easy Volume 1 and Volume 2 courses that are on HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com. That was generated and done for me by my good buddy Johnny Lipsham, who is an expert at programming MIDI in Studio One and in any other DAW for that matter, and he created those 2 courses. So if you're into creating your own drum parts in MIDI, go check out MIDI Drums Made Easy Volume 1 and Volume 2. All your MIDI programming questions will be answered in those 2 Made Easy series. Now, I'm not a big MIDI guy, which is why I had Johnny teach those courses for me. I'm someone who uses EZdrummer and Superior Drummer. To me, those are as realistic as drum sounds as you're ever going to get, and they're real easy to use. There's no programming involved. It's pretty much a drag and drop type of a program, and that's what I would suggest you use, Mark, and I know you mentioned that. Now, as far as making them sound more real, from an EQ and compression standpoint, isn't really what you need to make them sound more real, if I'm understanding your question. The thing about programming drums, whether it's in MIDI and you're doing it all from scratch, or whether you're using a program like EZdrummer, is I see a lot of people that use these kinds of programs to create drums, is they overdo it. And the key to making something sound more real, for most styles of music that is to keep the drum parts simple, especially the drum fills, where the drum fills are not these crazy fills. You want to think like a real drummer would, and you want to do things that complement the rest of the song. That is probably the biggest thing that I see people go wrong in, is they get these programmed drums and they program their own things, or they get all these, these great grooves from EZdrummer or Superior Drummer, and they patch together this ultimate drum track. It's just crazy drum technical fills, and it's just a big mess of drum sounds, and they sound really great, but they don't complement the song. And therefore, you can usually tell right away that it was probably not done by a real drummer, because a real drummer probably wouldn't play that way in that particular style of music. So be aware of the style of music that you're creating and what other commercial recordings sound like as far as the drums go, and keep your drums simple, and that is really going to help. The other tip that you can use too is with any of these programs, whether you're programming them yourself in MIDI or whether you're using something like EZdrummer or Superior Drummer or any of the other drum programs, is make sure you pay attention to the humanized features. Make sure you're not locking everything exactly to a grid so it sounds like a drum machine. A lot of these VSTs like EZdrummer will have these humanized kind of settings where it'll swing a little bit, it'll push ahead of the beat, push behind the beat a little bit to make it sound more realistic. The other thing is pay attention to the velocities and the way you're hitting the drums. Not everything is 100% velocity. You know, drummers play with dynamics, so make sure that your drum parts are created with dynamics. So those are a couple of tips. Now, from an EQ and a compression perspective to help them sound more real, I'm not really sure what you mean by that, and that would be way too long for me to try to get into that detail here in this episode. But if you really work on keeping the drums simple, working with the humanized feature, and making sure that you're not quantizing everything to a grid exactly all the time, and again, and also work with the velocities, Those three things will help your drums sound more real. And again, if you're working with a style of music, let's say country, for example, listen to a lot of country songs that are commercially on the radio, and listen to the drum parts, listen to how the drummer plays. And what I bet you're gonna find more times than not is the drum parts are a lot simpler than you probably even realize before you listen to it. Hope that helps you, Mark. Have any other questions? Be sure to write in. I'd be glad to help you. So now let's get on to this week's question number 2. Okay, question number 2 comes in from Kelly, and Kelly writes in, "Hi David, thank you for your email. As I'm going through your video courses, I have finally done a setup as an analog desk part in the video, etc. Unfortunately, adding all the plugins you mentioned makes my CPU processing has reached 75%. Is there a shortcut to the method to save on CPU? I'm using Studio One Professional version 3, and I'm using a Fire Studio Mobile on Windows 7 and an i5 4-core processor with 12 gigs of RAM at the moment. Is there another option of being connected to a remote server and not taxing the CPU? Any advice you could give me would be great. Thank you, Kelly." Well, Kelly, thanks for writing in. So what Kelly's referring to is the way, I believe this is a he, set up their plugins, is they're setting it up like an analog studio in their DAW. And I've done lots of videos on this, and especially in mixing with analog style plugins made easy. If you check out that course, it's exactly what I do. And basically what that means is for every instrument that you have in your session, you are setting it up with a tape machine, a channel strip, console emulation, so on and so forth. So what Kelly's running into is if you have, let's say, 20 tracks and you have 20 tape machines on each, all the tracks, 20 channel strips, 20 console emulation, now you're up to 60 plugins before you've done anything with EQ, compression, and any other kind of special processing, and that doesn't include your master bus or any kind of parallel compression. So what ends up happening is you end up having to use lots of plugins in a session to kind of achieve that kind of a setup in your DAW, which means that it's really going to tax your computer's CPU. And there are a couple of tricks. Now, Kelly says he has running Windows 7 with a quad-core processor i5 with 12 gigs of memory. So it's not a low-end machine by any means. But the first thing I would tell you to do is max out your RAM. So if you're using a desktop computer and you have 12 gigs, if you could put 24, 32, 64, whatever you can put into that machine, the more the better. RAM is probably the most inexpensive way to upgrade the performance of your computer. Now that doesn't necessarily help you with the CPU, but it'll help with the overall speed. The other thing you can do is you could start looking at other alternative ways of using plugins. Things like Universal Audio, things like the Wave Sound Grid, where you're using a piece of hardware to run a lot of your plugins off of, so you're not taxing your internal CPU. And when you see me do this kind of stuff in some of my mixing series, the more advanced series, you'll know I use a lot of Universal Audio plugins. One of the benefits to using Universal Audio, yes, the plugins sound amazing. I've said that a million times on my channel. But you're running the plugins off their hardware, which means you're not taxing the internal CPU. So there's a little bit of an investment in that. It's not terribly expensive, but it can be over time depending on how big of a system that you want. If you want to know, well, how many plugins can I run on a Universal Audio system? I have the answer. Go to my YouTube channel, and in the Universal Audio playlist, you'll see a video I just did within the last couple of months showing you my exact rig, how many plugins I can use, and I go through all of that, okay? The other option is you can do something now that Waves has out called, I think, the Sound Grid. Same kind of concept. You have a box that kind of plugs into your computer via Thunderbolt or USB 3, and you run all the Waves plugins off of that box, again, so you don't have to run it on your CPU. If either one of those options isn't going to help you because you budgetary reasons and that kind of thing, the only other thing you can really do is you got to kind of scale down the amount of plugins that you're using. So instead of putting, for example, if you have a drum kit with kick, snare, tom 1, tom 2, overheads, and rooms, so say you have 5 or 6 or 10 microphones on your drum kit, instead of putting 10 tape machines, 10 console emulators, you can route all those drums to a bus, and you can put the tape machine and the console emulation, let's say, on the bus, instead of putting it on the individual tracks. Is it as good, or is it as effective? No, it's a little, not really, and not if you want to go the full-blown, set my DAW up like an analog studio, but it's better than not using anything at all, and you can get some great results. So I would try that. That'll reduce the amount of plugins that you need, okay? So those are a couple of tips. As far as running stuff off a server, again, I don't know that that's really going to help you as far as the plugin thing. Really, it just comes down to how fast is your processor in your computer And that will dictate how many plugins you can use and depending on which plugins you're trying to use. If you're trying to use stock plugins, you're not going to have a problem. Stock plugins typically take up very little CPU, but that doesn't really give you the results that you're trying to do with your analog style mixing. You need these third-party plugins by Slate Digital, by Waves, by Universal Audio, and therefore when you pile it all in, if you don't have a real top-end machine maxed out with your RAM, you're going to have these kinds of problems. So you either got to make some compromises. Either you have to do it on a bus, like I just mentioned with the drums, or go out and see if you can invest in a Universal Audio hardware rig and or a Waves rig, and that's going to solve your problem. Okay? Any other questions, Kelly? Write in. I'd be glad to help you. And thanks for writing in. And now we'll get on to the next question for this week's episode, question number 3. Hey, question number 3 comes in on YouTube, and they didn't leave their name, so I'm not sure who wrote in, so I apologize up front, but let's read the question anyway. So it says, hi, I'm having an issue with crackling noises. I'm using a Pro Studio 192 PreSonus interface. I have a Windows 10 computer, and I'm using Pro Tools 12.7.1. I'm using Universal Control that came with the interface, and the block size on the Universal Control is set to 32 blocks. That's the buffer setting. But every time I try to change it to a higher setting, it crashes Pro Tools. I think that it might fix the crackling noises, but it won't let me change it. Do you have any ideas? I'll send photos of my block size on the Universal Control, if that helps you. But every time I try to change it to a higher setting, it crashes Pro Tools. What do you think? Thanks. Okay, well, thanks for writing in. So basically, whenever you're having audio artifacts that are going on when we use Studio One, or any DAW, but mostly in Studio One, I always tell people go into the preferences and change your buffer size or your block size. The lower, when you're doing recording, set it to a lower block size. When you're doing mixing and using lots of plugins, set it to the higher block size, and that will usually alleviate the problem. And that doesn't always alleviate the problem because some of this is tied to some of the CPU and the memory stuff we talked about in the last question. It's all kind of a system. But that normally will fix most of the problems for people in Studio One. Pro Tools is a lot different, and I haven't been on Pro Tools since Pro Tools 10, and I've gotten away from Pro Tools, and I don't even use it anymore because I had these same kind of issues in Pro Tools. Pro Tools I was on in version 7, in version 8, in version 9, in version 10, and from a stability point of view, whether it was Mac or PC, always had crashing issues, crackling issues, artifact issues, so on and so forth. Now, I used a native version of Pro Tools, not an HD rig. And I know people that use the HD rigs, and in commercial studios where they have these big HDX rigs, they're a hell of a lot more stable. The native system always had problems. I always had issues with Pro Tools, no matter what computers I was using, no matter what operating systems I was using. Pro Tools was always the most unstable DAW on the market, in my opinion, and probably still is today, although I know there's a lot of Pro Tools users out there that will, shoot me down and say I'm completely wrong, I don't know what I'm talking about. Fine, it's a matter of opinion. I would never use Pro Tools again. I'm not saying that you can't fix your problem with Pro Tools, but I don't use Pro Tools 12, so I really don't know. All I know is in Pro Tools you can change the buffer settings, and you can use that in conjunction with Universal Control on the Studio 192. And if you're still having all kinds of problems and crashing, again, I hate to say this, but this is the reason why I moved to Studio One, because Studio One is a hell of a lot more stable. And when you use Universal Control and a PreSonus interface, it just marries up so well with Studio One. I know everyone, a lot of people are afraid to do that, and I was too back in the day, because when you know a DAW so well, and I knew Pro Tools very, very well, I used it for years, and I learned all the workarounds. But when I went to Studio One, because I couldn't take the instability anymore, not to mention the lack of support, the cost of Pro Tools, it's crazy. And over time, it just, from a business perspective, it made no sense to me anymore for what I do to use Pro Tools. When I moved to Studio One, within a few months, the actual learning curve difference was so minimal. And now there are so many videos and so many people on YouTube that will show you how to cut down that learning curve to go from Pro Tools to Studio One. And you can make that move. Again, so I know you don't want to hear me tell you go buy a new DAW. I'm not saying you have to do that, but I don't have a fix for Pro Tools because I don't use it, and I know these kinds of problems, and I always had, like I said, a mess with Pro Tools. If you've ever thought about changing your DAW, think about changing your DAW. And I'd say go demo Studio One. You could demo it. You don't need to buy it. Demo it. Demo it for 30 days. If you have any questions at all, if you need any help on that conversion because you're scared to death to jump in, hit me up. I could tell you and I can point you to many, many resources in the PreSonus community on Facebook and YouTube and such that can help you with that transition. So I'm sorry I don't know your name, you didn't leave your name, and I'm sorry I can't give you a specific answer on how to fix this problem. The answer is I really don't know. If changing your block sizes is crashing Pro Tools, I'm not really sure. And again, you're on a Windows machine, I think you said here, so even being on a Windows machine, that's even worse. I'm not a Windows user, I'm a Mac user, so I'm not really sure. So I'm sorry I didn't give you the exact answer that you wanted, but if you have any other questions, you can hit me up. I'll try to help you as best I can, but I'm not into Pro Tools anymore, so sorry. But thank you for writing in anyway. I appreciate the question, and maybe this will help someone else who's having other Pro Tools issues, that's considering switching maybe to a different DAW. That might be something to think about. So anyway, that is the last question of this week's episode. Once again, thank you so much for joining me. Again, go to homerecordingmadeeasy.com, get your 5 free training courses, follow me on all the social media, hit me up with any more questions you have, and I'll feature your question in an upcoming episode. And this has been Dave at homerecordingmadeeasy.com, and I will see you in the next Questions and Coffee video. Take care.